Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. You may notice something different about this episode if you are a recurring viewer, but if you're not a recurring viewer, no, this setup isn't necessarily always the thing, but we're going to be using this time to be very abundantly clear. Even though if you are a recurring viewer or if you follow me on any social media account, you know where I stand on this already. In fact, so much so, I really didn't feel the need to make this video, which is why I didn't make it when, it was right when it started happening, but I waited a bit, because I felt that I couldn't do the topic justice unless I actually, tried my best to look into as much of the topic as I can. But before I put all the research to the test, first let's get right into the news. First, an update on the Guatemalan election. The Supreme Tribunal of Guatemala, the Electoral Tribunal of Guatemala, has unfortunately went back on its decision yet again. You see, if you remember, there's currently been a little bit of a, drama regarding it. It's basically a ping-pong on whether or not they believe that the Sameeh movement of President-elect Bernardo Arevalo is considered legal or not. And unfortunately, the TSE has announced that they will not be giving the Sameeh, they have suspended the Sameeh movement of Arevalo. Now, as I stated before, I've stated this before when this topic first came about, but this technically doesn't mean that Arevalo can't be president. Because as far as I can tell, Arevalo is officially the president. He is the president-elect. There's nothing that can change the president-elect status. But, as far as I know. But his party, if he doesn't have a party, then that means he will lose a lot of support within the legislative chamber, which is very troubling because he was already going to be in a legislative chamber that wasn't friendly to him, but now he doesn't have a bloc to help him. And this most recent one seems to be a very permanent solution. So, unfortunately, it looks like Bernardo Arevalo might be screwed. Not much else for me to say on that regard, because you also know that I am very much on the side of Bernardo Arevalo in this story. So let's move on to the next story. This one ties a little bit to the main topic, but I felt this was worthy enough to give its own story in and of itself. Now, as you know, the current situation going on in Israel and Palestine at the moment is causing a lot of nations to develop certain, they're basically drawing their lines on whose side they're on in this battle, as far as I know, currently metaphorically in most other nations' eyes. And most of the alignments are being very abundantly obvious. Western nations, of course, aligning with Israel, and basically everyone who is opposed to Western nations, whether it be for, literally any reason, usually aligning with Palestine. Some for not good reasons, Russia, but then ones who are actually doing it for pretty good intentioned reasons, particularly Latin America. And Latin America has been getting very involved with this situation, with 4 of their most recent leaders in the recent wave of the pink tide basically doing anything to start removing ties to Israel. 3 of them, Gustavo Petro, Gabriel Boric, and Xiomara Castro, revoking their ambassadors to Israel, which of course has earned them some ire, which many of them have been able to clap back on very obviously on, such as Petro, who has basically said, our nation does not support genocide, sorry. But the biggest one, the most noticeable one, is Bolivia, which had decided to completely sever its entire relationship with Israel. Now, this isn't actually the first time Bolivia has cut ties with Israel. They actually cut ties with Israel back in 2009 after the initial Gazan war, but they were brought back after the whole coup in Bolivia led to them aligning completely with Israel, because when a Western-backed coup then, aligns with the West, it's not really anything surprising. So yeah, base all the way. Let's move on to the next story. A very interesting development, which is the exact opposite of what happened in Latin America, also relating to the main topic of this video. So, there's now a new trend, there's now been a new thing going around, where they have dubbed a couple of Democrats in the House of Representatives the Tax Cheat 12, because in the wake of the most recent Israel-Hamas Gaza war stuff, after the U.S. Congress voted on a bill to basically say we 100% support Israel, no ifs, ands, or buts, they've also decided to do something interesting. There was a bill in the U.S. Congress called the Israel Security Supplemental Appropriations Act, which was going to take $14.3 billion that was going to be funding the IRS, which was explicitly appropriated for the express purpose of chasing down tax avoiders in the highest earning brackets. And this bill would defund that and then send that funding to Israel. And the 12 Democrats that voted for it are Josh Gothmeier, Jared Moskowitz, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Louis Frankel, Jared Golden, Juan Vargas, Angie Craig, Darren Soto, Haley Stevens, Frederica Wilson, Don Davis, and Greg Landsman. All names that should be having primary challenges floated around against them. The very weird thing is that not even like a bunch of pro-Israel Dems were even in favor of this because of how it was worded. They would have just wanted the money to come from a different source, not this source in particular. But anyways, let's move on to the next story. This story is coming from Missouri, where a guy who was running for Senate named Wesley Bell has decided to suspend his bid for Senate and then decided to announce a primary bid against Cori Bush. Very opportunistic grifter is very opportunistic, and he's basically abundantly stated that the reason why he's jumping in is because a lot of top Democrats literally told him to run against Cori Bush. But two very interesting things have popped up through this announcement. For starters, one of the reasons why he announced a Senate bid against Josh Hawley, because Josh Hawley is the one he's running against, was that his primary concern was the fact that Josh Hawley was like ruining democracy. So then it's like, why are you now changing your tune and running against Cori Bush? Like, do you legitimately believe that she is a bigger threat to democracy than Josh Hawley is? Which kind of details a lot of Democratic Party's priorities in this regard. But also, one of the weirdest things that he has stated about this is that he is going around claiming how he was the candidate that was the best suited to beat Josh Hawley. And yet, despite this, he's actually choosing, like, even though he's saying he is the best suited to beat Hawley, he is suspending his bid in favor of running against Cori Bush. That doesn't quite make sense. If you're the best suited to beat a certain candidate, why are you then bowing out of that race in favor of going into a different race? Another thing that doesn't quite make sense is one of the reasons why he is saying that he's running against Cori Bush. Well, I mean, it makes sense to a degree, but then it doesn't make sense, and then you go, oh, now it makes sense. Because one of the things that he's been decrying Cori Bush for is saying that this district needs a foreign policy leader. To which it's like, wait, what? This man has no experience in foreign policy. Cori Bush has been in the House for a couple of years now, so she has, by extension, more experience in foreign policy than he does. But then you hear what he means when he says we need a foreign policy expert. Because one of the first things that he said when he went to his meetings and he made his announcement was, of course, Israel. So what he's saying is he wants someone who's an expert at murdering children. That's what he wants. Not much to say because I don't think this bid will do the best. Like, realistically, this isn't really the target seat. Because we do see that there are a lot of people who are targeting the squad, because the squad will be a bit more on the defensive in this cycle, especially with this most recent development. But hopefully the squad will be able to pull through again. Speaking of someone who sadly didn't pull through, Ady Barkan has recently passed away at the age of 39. For those who don't remember or know who Ady Barkan is, Ady Barkan was an activist for single-payer healthcare who had ALS. He was diagnosed with ALS in 2016 and basically spent the last remaining years of his life fighting for a single-payer system. Well, there's been a lot of disagreements with a lot of the people. Like, there's been some times where people have been a bit more critical of him, such as when he endorsed Elizabeth Warren over Bernie Sanders in the 2020 election. Then after Elizabeth Warren dropped out, he then jumped on the Bernie train. But most people didn't really hold that much ill will to him. In fact, he basically got a ton of praise after his passing, even from some people who people are a little bit mad at, like Pete Buttigieg, who said that he was fighting for access to healthcare, to which everyone said, no, he was not fighting for access, he was fighting for single-payer healthcare. But yeah, I just felt that it was notable to point out, R.I.P. Ady. And the last news story is something interesting because this is where it's another house retirement, but it's a house retirement that's actually kind of not good. Representative Earl Blumenaur, who was arguably one of the better members of the United States House of Representatives, said that he will not run for another term. Now, what I find interesting is the fact that he's announcing his retirement a election cycle after Peter DeFazio, which I just find a little weird. Like, I have a feeling that they might have actually just coordinated their retirement efforts, where it's like, I'll stay in a little longer, and then you, so that they don't have the entire House delegation of Oregon to, like, have a election bid. Now, what you might be thinking is, open blue seat, but almost immediately after the race, like, after he announced his retirement, it seems that that open blue seat almost immediately became closed, because a Multnomah County Commissioner from the 2nd District announced that they will be entering the race. That commissioner being Sushila Jayapal. And no, that name isn't a coincidence. Sushila is actually the sister of Pramila Jayapal, one of the top progressives in the United States House of Representatives. So a lot of people have kind of considered the race to kind of be over already, because Sushila is such a big name, and she will have the backing of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, obviously. Whether it be formally or informally, I don't know if she will officially endorse. I don't know if the PAC will officially endorse her, because I think that might lead to a bit of a conflict of interest. But it seems like Jayapal herself is backing her, obviously. Like, I mean, she's just openly stated that she's backing her, so yeah. Now, Sushila's campaign website is a little blank at the moment, but I think I would end up endorsing her just because even though it is, like, blank and full of platitudes, the platitudes lean a bit more in the direction of good. Like, for example, when they say health, like, there are a lot of people whose websites are sort of blank platitudes, and they say, like, healthcare is a human right, and then they, like, say, like, access or whatever, but Sushila's website, at the very least, has the word free in the spiel. It's like free access to healthcare. So it's like, I guess that does indicate that she's a supporter of Medicare for all. But we have to wait and see on that regard. Speaking of things that we don't have to wait and see about, let's move on to the main topic of this video. Yes, it is finally time for me, of all people, to talk about the Israel-Palestine situation outside of news stories, because I guess of all the people who needed to talk about it, it had to be me. Now, if you're a recurring viewer of this channel, you already know my stance on this, and judging by the thumbnail, title, and this, you probably already know my position already. But I didn't want to necessarily just do the topic about, like, just me giving my position on the issue. I kind of wanted to do a little bit more in-depth research on the topic in general, like, you know, a bit of the history prior to the events that are relevant. You know, especially, like, if you're a left-winger who's watching this, you might want to, at the very least, know a little bit more history about the subject, even if you don't necessarily know or care about certain parts of the history, because, look, bro, I think we could all just learn to get a little bit more informed on the topic before we all decide to go a little bit overboard with our positions. Don't worry, this will inevitably tie back into what's going on right now, obviously, and we'll get a bit more we'll go to that part later, but you'll see when I get to those parts, I'm going to be probably a bit more energized, and probably a bit more like out of the cover and talking a lot more like this, because it's just when you get to the positions of that's focusing on the literally here and now and developing situations, that's where people are going to get a bit more heated than when you're looking over history that is long irrelevant to your personal life. Now, if you're a Palestinian who is watching this, then there's a good chance that I'll be saying this history and you will be overheated, or if you're an Israeli, or if you're Jewish or Muslim or whatever. But I just mean from my perspective on that regard. Anyways, let's just get into it. So, one big thing that I want to talk about first is where we begin, because some people, particularly on the pro-Israel side, want to start the history long ago. Like, one of the big things that is talked about a lot when we talk about Israel's policies nowadays and all this other stuff is usually some perspective of like, oh, you stopped the history books at 75 years ago. Meanwhile, I'm going to start my history from 4,000 years ago. And that, you see, 4,000 years ago, Jewish people owned the land, ergo, they have a right to the land because they owned it thousands of years ago. The truth of the matter is, that is completely irrelevant to what is going on right now. And I'm not just saying this about like the Israel-Palestine situation. I'm talking about like a lot of history from that long ago really just doesn't really, like, I mean, it's really not relevant at all to the modern day outside of literally just educational purposes. Not in the sense of like educating us so that we are better adept for the modern day. Like, no, like, let's be real. A lot of this stuff is completely irrelevant. 1977 BCE means absolutely nothing to a person in 2023 CE. The pro-Israel side thinks it's a gotcha because it's like, oh, but you bring up 75 years ago. That's because people from 75 years ago are still alive. And such, or they are the children of those people who are still, like, literally. That's not to say that you can't start history from before people were, like, before an era where people were still alive. But it's like, there's a certain degree, there's a certain point where it stops becoming relevant. Like American history, we started American history at 17, like something, like a little bit over 1700s. Actually, that's not true. For some reason, American history starts at like the 1600s, because those are the things that are relevant to understanding American history. Colonialism is relevant to understand American history. Jamestown and the Roanoke colony are somewhat relevant to discussing American history. Where it gets crazy is for some reason when we talk about Columbus, but that's a different story. But otherwise, there is a direct link that ties that era to this era. But American history stops before we get into the Native American tribes that existed long before any of the other developments, because they're viewed as not really having a direct correlation to modern day America. And in that scenario, Sargon II, who was apparently relevant to very early Israelite history, that's not really relevant outside of like learning about biblical history or just purely educational purposes. It's not really relevant to the modern day political situation, especially considering it is literally that long ago. There is literally no direct correlation between the Israelites of ancient times to the Israelis of modern day outside of vague religious practices, really. And again, like, I looked into this. Apparently, it's not even like one-to-one. It's not even like Judaism to Judaism, because apparently, if you go that far back, it's not Judaism. Judaism didn't exist yet. Like, again, they specifically cite 4,000 years ago. Like, I always say that number, like 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. But 4,000 years ago, Judaism didn't exist. The religion that was celebrated in that area around that time period was Yahwehism, which was the precursor of Christianity and Judaism. Like, literally learning about the ancient kings and queens of that time period are relevant. So let us focus on modern day relevant history. The beginning of the modern Palestinian-Israeli conflict began around the World War I era. The territory that we all know nowadays as Israel and Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And of course, they would end up clashing with Britain and other Western nations during World War I. And one method that the Brits used to gain prevalence in the region was to aid revolutionary groups that also hated the Ottomans, basically saying, hey, you guys hate the Ottomans too, so how about you help us take down the Ottomans, and in exchange, we will give you this land in return, and you're free to do whatever the heck you wanted with this land. And they're like, oh, good deal. Usually by a man by the name of Thomas Edward Lawrence, who you may all know as Lawrence of Arabia. Surprisingly, the British didn't keep up their end of the bargain, and instead aligned with France to start divvying up the land however they saw fit. Well, I assume at the very least they were able to negotiate with the Arab leaders to maybe figure out how to divide the land in the most equitable and fair way. What the fuck do you think happened? They literally just started dividing up the land willy-nilly, separating ethnic groups and villages while forcing other ones together. The most prominent example is, of course, being having Sunni and Shia Muslims end up being in the same country while separating Sunnis from Sunnis and Shias from Shias. Now, the Brits were dividing up the land with the French to see however they wanted, but the League of Nations had asked Britain to create a land known as Palestine. Palestine was already a territory in it, but they were basically designed to take that territory that was dubbed Palestine and then divide it up to be its own thing. But it wasn't intended to be its own nation, because there was another development that was happening around the time which dictated the purpose of this so-called Palestinian region. And in order to see how this development happened, we have to rewind a little bit. Mid-1800s, we began the creation of an ideology known as Zionism, which at the time was defined as a creation and maintaining of a Jewish state. We had many similar movements prior, but the movement that really defined Zionism was kickstarted when a French soldier named Alfred Dreyfus was arrested for accusations of treason against France. All because of the simple fact that he was Jewish. The reason why that was considered a big deal was not only because France was a Western nation that wasn't typically seen as a hotbed of anti-Semitism, because, the fact of the matter is the West and other European nations usually perceive themselves as being they knew anti-Semitism was there, but it was at the very least, it wasn't like a backwards nation. It wasn't like the olden days where people could literally just kill you for being Jewish. But France was very different because it was actually the first nation that explicitly granted Jews equal rights to Christians. So the fact that a man could get an anti-Semitic crime given to him, in that nation, if that nation was able to have that happen to a Jewish person, a lot of Jews were like, if we're not safe here, then where the hell are we safe? So a man by the name of Theodor Herzl began lobbying hard for the creation of an independent Jewish state. And where else would this nation state go than the place of Palestine, as it was considered the Jewish Holy Land on many religious texts, due to the fact that these religious texts had the Jews living in this area. And that's one of the big things that is kind of weird when you use religion or the super ancient history to try to develop your modern day history, because the reason why the Jews are in the Holy Land in the Bible or in the Torah or in the Quran or whatever, the reason why they are in those lands is because they were in those lands at the time period. I know it's one huge flaw that nobody seems to understand with all these religious factors. It's things were written that way because that was how things were at the time period. And then people say, no, you see, this is actually predicting the future. But it's no, it's what a man from that time period thought the future was, because where in those texts does it say we have cars? It's funny. It's even though it says the beginning of time in that book, and apparently the end times, there isn't mention of things that really do indicate that it is the future or the past. Doesn't mention a dinosaur, doesn't mention a plane, because in that time period, neither of those things were even remotely comprehensible. Maybe you should actually start looking at the real world and not your fantasy land. But anyways, due to this, that's where Zionist groups felt that they would be the safest, because it was it's the Holy Land in our books, ergo, this is the place where we need to go. Now, there were a lot of factors as to why they didn't necessarily want to go there. Some, remaining Arab, Muslim anti-Semitism, but they're no, this is the area that we think is the safest. And then the things that started kicking them into more overdrive was the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in 1903. So they lobbied harder than before. And the two nations that the Zionist lobby decided to focus their attention on was the United States of America and the United Kingdom. And after some lobbying, they eventually got the politicians in both of these nations to look into it further. And in 1917, near the end of World War I, they managed to get the UK to officially push for the state of Palestine to be created as a Jewish state via the Balfour Declaration. And in 1992, a bill in the United States Congress was passed declaring that they also supported the Balfour Declaration. Now, the United States bill I find interesting based on two regards, and it all stems from how they got the bill to pass. Because initially, the first person that they went to get the bill to pass in the United States House was Socialist Party Congressman Meyer London. He was a Jewish representative from a heavily Jewish district, so naturally he was one of the first people to go to. However, London said no to this bill, stating that while he believed that, quote, a separate and distinct national existence fortified by a Jewish state was a good idea, he also stated that, quote, all that I ask of them is that they should not speak in the name of all Jews, unquote, as well as saying that if it, quote, can be accomplished without violating the socialist principle which forbids forcible annexation, unquote. So basically, Meyer London, while he did believe that a Jewish state would be a good idea, his own principles prevented him from doing forcible annexation of someone else's land in order to get that to happen. That same year, Meyer London was defeated for re-election, thus making Meyer London the first congressman to be defeated by the Israeli lobby. Great job, guys. Great job. You're really standing up for Jewish people right now. The Israeli lobby, standing up for Jews as long as you're the right one since 1920. But also, you know who they ended up actually getting to pass this bill? To who they actually ended up getting to bring this bill to a floor vote and end up passing it? Do you know who the Israeli lobby actually asked? A congressman by the name of Hamilton Fish III, who in World War II was under congressional investigation for working with a literal Nazi asset named George Sylvester Viereck. Like, literally, this guy was a Nazi asset, and they found more kinship with him than Meyer London. I mean, considering the fact that the modern-day Israeli lobby has more kinship with Marjorie Taylor Greene than they do with Andy Levin, I guess that makes sense. However, despite these two resolutions passing, Zionism was a little bit weird because it was in this weird limbo where it was like, on paper, they had support from the West, but they mostly had to do it themselves. They basically had to find, like, people who were Jewish or otherwise sympathetic to the cause of Zionism who happened to have a lot of money to get them to help people move to those areas because people were just not really that enthused outside of people in this field. As such, many Jews ended up starting to move to Palestine and were met with various reactions, which led to said Jews to form paramilitaries to attack the Palestinians who were dissatisfied. Imagine having that much confidence to walk up into people's houses and be like, yo bro, this is my house now, and then killing them when they don't see your way. Wait, literally every other Western nation did the exact same thing. So I guess a lot of people do have a lot of confidence. But even then, like, the West seemed to basically ignore the cause of Zionism. They basically were like, yeah, you guys do whatever you want to do. We're just going to do our own thing. They got especially annoyed when a lot of Zionist organizations started causing an ire, by saying like, hey, guys, there's this guy in Germany. He's saying like a lot of this weird stuff. So I think it'd be best if you guys help us a lot more with moving refugees from certain areas into this like Palestine area. Bro, why the heck you keep nagging us for? We're trying to do our own stuff. You guys do your own thing. No, but I'm being serious. This guy's like saying some really weird stuff, and like he's putting a lot of us in like these like areas that are really low income. He's like, dude, come on, dude. We did that to black people in America, dude. Come on, it's no big deal. Yeah, but like he's taking us to go on these trains, and like a lot of these people, we haven't heard from them since. Like, can you maybe, like, come on, dude, just chill out, dude, chill out. No, but, like, dude, I know you guys are, like, really anti-Semitic, too. I know you guys are, like, have, like, this closet anti-Semitism, but, like, no, this guy's, like, being a little bit more, very blatant about it. It's like, and then the Holocaust happened, and the West basically did a complete 180 in regards to their entire policy on Zionism, with the new international org that they put together, the United Nations, finally putting pen to paper to formally create a Jewish state in mandatory Palestine, finally passing Resolution 1812 in 1947. With many controversies on the passage of said bill, 9 countries being on the record as saying there was a pressure campaign for them, many of which being financial. Indian Prime Minister at the time, Jawaharlal Nehru, saying that Zionists tried to bribe India with millions of dollars, and also that there were threats against his UN delegate, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, who was also his sister. Now, the way that Palestine was divided was a bit weird, but I always assumed that the reason why it was divided in that way was to incentivize the Palestinian and the Arab world to back off. They not only got the West Bank, which gave them effective control around the holy city of Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem was slated to be like an independent city, sort of like how Berlin was, but they were also going to get the Gaza Strip, which basically meant good trade with the rest of the world. However, Palestinians surprisingly said no, because even though they were effectively a colony by the British for that entire period of time, they effectively viewed themselves as an independent nation after World War II. Plus, there was a little bit of anti-Semitism still in there. Like, you see, the thing is, like, there's, like, a little bit of a controversy when looking into it, because there was, like, a little bit of anti-Semitism in the Palestinian territories and a lot of Arab territories during World War II, and some people, especially in the government, did collaborate with Hitler, but there was also a lot of sentiment outside, like, especially from the common people of those areas that felt sympathetic to the Jewish cause during World War II. And so there was basically a lot of fighting between the Arab world and the Israeli world. And Israel won and forcibly removed 700,000 Palestinians from their home and forced them to just move wherever the hell else in an incident that we all know today as the Nakba. And with this whole, after all that happened, things seemed, quote-unquote, good. Relative peace outside of radicals on both sides fighting for more, but there was always tension between the Arab world and the West, such as when Egyptian President Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which caused Israel to fight them for a week in 1936. Then tensions rose again in 1976, and they fought for another week. But after this war, Israel began to do something a little interesting. You see, after their fight with Palestine in that regard, they actually ended up getting a little bit more territory due to the peace deal. So they ended up expanding a little bit more. And then they started to do it a little bit more, because what they would end up doing would be, they would end up having a couple people move to the areas where it's like just close enough to Palestine, but still technically in Israeli territory. And then it's like, oh, we gotta go send some soldiers over there to protect them. You know, we don't want the Palestinians around that area to, like, be mean to them. So they move those soldiers over there, and then, coincidentally, when they move over there, somehow there's, like, a little bit extra land. And they do it again, and then again, and then again, and then they just keep encroaching over Palestinian territory. A thing that was so controversial that even the US president, who was supposedly one of the biggest Israel simps ever, like, it doesn't matter who was the president at the time, like, they usually are considered a huge Israel simp, even they had to, at one point, denounce the idea of these settlements. And this is when it started entering a lot of people's minds that the Israel-Palestine conflict was basically that issue that will never get solved. That issue that's just so complex, so convoluted, that nobody's able to figure out a solution to the problem. Because it's the easiest way to paint the issue if you don't actually pay attention to the issue. When you ignore the Israel encroaching on Palestinian land, it's easy to then go, oh, it's a little bit more convoluted and a little bit complex than that. And America, who wants to put themselves as the main character of every single geopolitical situation, is like, I will be the savior of this problem. I will fix it. And every US president has essentially tried to do something to try and fix the situation in regards to Israel-Palestine. It seems that the closest that we actually got was during the time period where Palestine was run by a man by the name of Yasser Arafat of the political party known as Fatah. And it probably has something to do with the fact that Fatah was not necessarily, I guess you could say, but I mean, when most people think of how Muslims and Arabs in the area are, the Westerners have a very skewed perspective. But Arafat was not really in that realm. He was extremely secular, he was rather left-wing, he was pretty, quote-unquote, reasonable, and that was the closest that the US ever seemed to have in regards to actually getting some peace deal with Palestine and Israel. Now, despite the fact that I say it was the closest, that doesn't mean that we were close to actually getting a deal, but what I mean is, at least on paper, it looked like things were better. Arafat kept meeting with Clinton and the leader of Israel, and they seemed conciliatory, but a deal would just never seem to be reached, which would lead to many in Palestine to start changing their views on Arafat. Originally viewing Arafat as a really good politician and a really good person, they kind of started feeling that Arafat might be not necessarily that effective, and they started turning to a different group that was prevalent in the area. A group known as Hamas, a Sunni Islamist political party / jihadist group, founded in the 80s after the first Intifada, which is the first time where Palestinians rose up to try and protest against the Israeli occupation. As I mentioned before, it was a very huge contrast with Fatah, the party that did control Palestine at the time period. Fatah is a very secular party, Hamas was not. Fatah was mostly peaceful, Hamas was not. Fatah was social democratic, Hamas was not. And the biggest contrast of them all was Fatah was okay with a two-state solution with an Israel and a Palestine, but Hamas was very much not, believing the only solution would be complete obliteration of Israel and refoundation of an entirety Palestinian area. And while they were small at first, a multitude of factors contributed to their rise of power. Continued Israeli expansion, Western sabotage of Arafat's peace deals, leading to Fatah being viewed as very ineffective, which all could have been avoided, which could have still had to Arafat to be relatively powerful in the region. But then, much like other world leaders who had political parties that were in somewhat of a decline, but they were able to manage to remain powerful, Arafat passed away, which would then lead to Fatah to kind of be stuck in a realm of we don't know what to do now, which was an opening that Hamas needed to win the Palestinian elections in 2006, which only proved to strengthen Israel's resolve to quell them. And as such, Hamas viewed that they needed to be more radical against Israel, and as such, Israel needed to be more radical against Hamas. And then Hamas, ergo, viewed that they needed to be more radical against Israel, which led to Israel to be more radical against Hamas, which is what led to this area in Palestine and Israel to start to just blend in with a lot of the other Western conflicts in the region. Because while Arafat was able to quell, at the very least, it from blending in with a lot of other Islamic terrorism in the area, unfortunately, with the rise of Hamas, that ended up just becoming the thing. People were just like, yeah, this is just typical. This is just how the Middle Eastern region is. Which is, of course, a big problem because the West always likes to pretend to, they always like to ignore their causes and factors into how these situations pan out, and then get confused and completely ignore what is going on at the moment. Like, for example, I'll use this one because this is the biggest incendiary one for Americans. 9/11. What caused 9/11? The US helped make Al-Qaeda a thing, and we also aided and abetted Israel. They ignore that part, and then when a group who very much is opposed to America's geopolitical interests in the region then go, "Aw, man, how did this happen?" And then they keep doing the things that caused the first thing to happen, which then leads to more Islamic terrorism to happen against the United States. And then they go, what? How did this happen again? Come on, dude. How did we get another bombing attack? How did this happen? Maybe the solution is to send more bombs to the region. And it's the same thing with Israel and Hamas. Like, Israel, they not only have done all those things previously, but these are things they are continuing to do to this day. They continue to expand into Palestinian territories. They continue to take people's homes and then murder them unilaterally. They continue to make Palestinians live in an apartheid state and treat them as third-class citizens. And then Hamas attacks them, and they go like, what? How did this happen? And let me be clear, this isn't a thing that started with Netanyahu. This is a thing that started when Israel was founded. Like, the Labour Party of Israel is just as much guilty of many of these atrocities as Likud. The only difference is Likud is more open about it. The only political parties in Israel that have their hands are completely clean of all of this are Hadash-Tal and Balad. Those two are like the only two political parties in Israel that don't have their hands covered in Palestinian blood. And Israeli politicians have just been steadily going further and further to the right on this issue, because as they realize they can get away with more and more things, they just start going a bit more blatant. Like, at first, it's just like, oh yeah, well, this just happened to be conveniently like this. There's just this like territorial dispute like, in this small particular area. Like, it's not really a big, broader policy. Then you get people like Benjamin Netanyahu that literally just have maps that are just like, yeah, I just plan to annex like this entire territory right now, and nobody can stop me. And this recent Hamas war has basically been the kickstart to overdrive, where Israel has literally just said, hey, people who live in the Gaza Strip, leave Gaza City right now. You have 24 hours, and we're going to cut off all your internet and all your water and all your food and whatever. And you have to leave this area, and we're going to do a ground invasion immediately. And if you guys don't do it, sorry. And that's not even that far off from the actual fucking truth of the situation. Like, for some reason, like, okay, well, not for some reason, it's pretty obvious. Israel knows they can get away with anything. So this particular aspect of the conflict, Israel supporters and Israel itself is just being overtly evil. Like, they're just being overtly evil in this scenario. You've had like the Israeli prime minister account literally being like, yeah, so we funded money to people who to make sure that it's illegal to question our government. Yeah, sure, we've done that. We've had the Israeli government ban certain politicians in Israel from holding office for certain days because they are openly critical of the conflict. We've had many Israeli politicians openly stating that the conflict is the children of light in Israel versus the children of darkness, which is Palestine. Yeah, and don't cover any of this objectively, because if you do, you're actually aiding and abetting Hamas. Don't take my word for it. Former Prime Minister Yair Lapid.
If the international media is objective, it serves Hamas. If it just shows both sides, it serves Hamas.
Imagine just point blank stating that if you cover the events that are going on objective, you are serving the bad guys in this scenario. And Israel's not fucking joking about that either. Many journalists have freaking died by Israeli arms killing them due to their coverage of the conflict. Shireen Abu Akleh, Mohammed Abu Hatab, Majed Andras, Iyad Matar, Imad Al-Wahidi, Majed Kashko, Nazmi Al-Nadim, Yasser Abu Namous, Duaa Sharaf, Saed Al-Halabi, Ahmed Abu Mhadi, Salma Mkhaimer, Mohammed Imad-Labad, Roshdi Sarraj, Roee Idan, Mohammed Ali, Khalil Abu Aathra, Sameeh Al-Nady, Mohammad Balousha, Issam Bhar, Abdulhadi Habib, Yusuf Maher Dawas, Salam Mema, Husam Mubarak, Issam Abdallah, Ahmed Shehab, Mohammed Abu Matar, Saed Al-Tawil, Mohammed Saab, Hisham Al-Wanja, Asad Shamlak, Shai Regev, Ayelet Anrin, Yaniv Zohar, Mohammed Al-Salih, Mohammed Jargan, Ibrahim Mohammed Lafi. I mean, forgive me for mispronouncing a lot of those. I'm pretty sure I mispronounced a ton of them. I'll include the names of a lot of these guys in the comment section at the very least, I think, and the description. But, interesting fact, of all those journalists, Shireen is the only one that hasn't been killed by this most recent conflict. The rest of them are all from this conflict alone. 36 journalists! The only reason I included Shireen in that countdown was because I know for a fact Shireen is probably the most well-known in the West. And other deaths in this conflict apparently exceed 7,700 people from Palestine being killed, including 3,000 children with 19,000 injured. And again, a lot of this stuff is like very fucking cartoonish. Because it's like, they tell these people, you have this much time to leave this area, and then, do whatever, and then we'll do whatever we do. Then people leave these areas, and then Israel then goes, kills a bunch of people. They die if they stay, they die if they leave. Almost as if they want them to die. Shh, but you can't call this part out, because, Israel, they're the good guys. I mean, we're at the point where literally people will just post tweets saying genocide bad, and then the immediate response is, but do you denounce Hamas? I mean, this came from literally completely reprehensible people. Candace Owens literally posted a tweet saying genocide bad, and then Dave Rubin replied, but what about your condemnation of Hamas? And then Candace Owens responds with, it's almost interesting that after I just said genocide, you immediately went to defending Israel. Very interesting. The literal Twitter account of fucking Israel was calling out the UN's Human Rights Division, because the UN's Human Rights Division said, human rights are good. And then they were like, but what about Israelis? I just cannot fathom. This is why I didn't want to make this video. I will get into it again later. But this is legitimately why I didn't want to make this video, because it's just the situation is becoming super fucking cartoonish. And I do not understand how people can just go look at any of this stuff and then go, Israel's the good guys. I guess while we're here, let's just get into this part. Let's dispel some of the rumors and stupid things that have been spreading about Palestine, Israel, that people are using to somehow justify the conflict. First, let's start off with this. This is the first immediate one that I'm just going to say. It's anti-Semitic to oppose Israel. Literally completely obvious bullshit. There are some people who oppose Israel due to anti-Semitic reasons, but it is not anti-Semitic to call out apartheid. It is not anti-Semitic to call out genocide. None of my issues with Israel have anything to do with the fact that it is a Jewish state. Literally none of them. Literally, if they were any other religion, or if they weren't religious at all, I would still not be on the side of Israel. And if Israel wasn't doing any of the things that it was doing now, and was a Jewish state, nobody would bat an eye. Or at least nobody sane would bat an eye. Let's say, hypothetical scenario. All that happened was the Nakba. That was the one tragic event in Israeli history. But after that, there was no expansion, there was no apartheid. They somehow managed to negotiate peace. Maybe even one step further, and they managed to negotiate that some Palestinians would have the right to return back to Israel to get their homes. A majority of people would not be that opposed to Israel. Sure, they might still call foul with a lot of its earliest endeavors, but you can do that with literally any single Western country. You can do that with basically any country. Every country has a history of imperialism and colonialism to an extent. The problem is, some continue that tradition, while others have at the very least tried to remove themselves from that tradition. You would literally only get those people who would say this kind of stuff on extremely far left college campuses and/or radical Arabs, radical Palestinians. But, for example, Hamas would be incredibly smaller if Israel hadn't done any of the things afterwards. Much like how if the US stopped doing a lot of its things in the Middle East, a lot of jihadist groups would be very much not in the realm of prominence. The next one, Hamas uses human shields. Now first, let's give some definitions. A human shield is a non-combatant or a group of non-combatants who either volunteers or is forced to shield a legitimate military target in order to deter the enemy from attacking it. Now, since Hamas is the official government of, at the very least, the Gaza Strip, because apparently the West Bank has basically rejected the validity of the Hamas government and is basically still run by Fatah, but the Gaza Strip still remains under the control of Hamas. But due to this fact, Israel is very wishy-washy and very loose with its interpretations of what is considered a human shield. Like, here's what a human shield is supposed to be. Say you're on a battlefield with an opponent, and then that opponent pulls out a baby and then puts it in front of their head or chest and then holds it in front of them so that you can't fire them. That is what a human shield is. That's the literal definition of a human shield. Or if a military base is built specifically next to a populated city so that you can't go in without actually going into the city. But that is like very specifically meant for like on the ground war. Not typically the air warfare that Israel typically uses. But due to the fact that Hamas is considered the legitimate government of the Gaza Strip, technically a lot of areas are considered under Hamas control. For example, what are some things that the government controls in America that you know of? Aside from literal government buildings, like Congress or the White House or whatever else, how about the police offices, the post office, the DMV? Water filtration units are controlled by state and local governments. So basically, Israel uses the logic of, if you're around anything that is controlled by the government, you technically are near Hamas. So we can bomb and strike down those areas. And if you're in the collateral damage, it's not our fault. You were next to Hamas. Why didn't you just move away from Hamas? Oh yeah, and by the way, even though the whole point of this endeavor is for us to have your land, you can't just go and leave. No. You're forced to stay in this area, controlled by the enemy combatants we're trying to get rid of, but you have to all specifically choose to move far away enough from them so that you're not in the shrapnel. Oh yeah, and by the way, another thing that is interesting is that the whole point of this, of like a human shield, is supposed to be for like fighting soldiers. Like, not people who are going home. Because remember, the people of Hamas, they live in that city too. So literally, it's just like this. There's an apartment complex, and one person happens to be a member of Hamas. Now Israel gets the right to blow up that entire building, and then go, there was a guy who was Hamas in that building, so we had to kill the entire building. Which is a thing Israel does literally all the time. They literally go, literally every time they bomb a hospital or a thing, they go, Hamas was doing that. They literally, just today as I'm recording this, they bombed an ambulance and then tweeted, by the way, that ambulance, it had Hamas in it. And despite the fact that they know, quote unquote, they know that Hamas keeps using human shields, they keep conveniently always falling for it. They keep conveniently always going aw, man, we were going to shoot that Hamas soldier, but then he, held up this 5-year-old, so I guess we had to shoot the 5-year-old too. We couldn't have, walked around him and then shot the soldier and then let the 5-year-old go. We couldn't have, called up another soldier to, go behind him or anything of the sort. No. We had to, shoot this 5-year-old and the Hamas soldier. An example is in the Great March of Return massacre, where a ton of protesters were protesting against they were protesting against Israeli occupation, obviously, and they killed 183 protesters, not combatants. There were no combatants in the area, no weapons. Snipers killed 183 protesters, including 35 children, and their excuse is so fucking malarkey. Not only did they claim Hamas set this up, but they also claimed that Hamas intentionally set it up this way so that they could trick people into thinking that Palestinians were peaceful. Let me get this straight. You force a group of people to be considered as subhuman, like pieces of filth. You don't allow them to have any sort of legitimacy in the land that they call home. And whenever they want to make their voices heard, they get murdered. Whenever they have people point out the atrocities against them, they get murdered. And they can't protest or do any sort of civil disobedience, or else they'll get murdered. You've backed them in a corner. Like, what else do you think is going to happen? And I guess I should say this because I would assume that you guys would understand that a bi-socialist atheist would not really be in this crowd. But I guess I'll just say it again. I don't think I said it before, but I'll just say it here. And I'll probably include the text when the segment begins, just so that you know this. Hamas bad, Hamas bad, Hamas bad, Hamas bad. I do not like Hamas. Much like in the same way where it's like, I don't like rioting. But the thing is, when you keep ignoring the peaceful measures, what else do you think is going to happen? Like when this particular conflict panned out, like I played a Hassan clip and it's still relevant because it's like, what else do you think was going to happen? But back to like the topic at hand before we switch to the next part, I actually found this comic by somebody who was like saying, I think this is supposed to be a Norman Finkelstein quote, but I can't find the actual quote that he said. But I think this very much exemplifies the hypocrisy and bullshit behind this sort of mentality. So it goes like this. If Hamas blows up a bus, as it used to do in Tel Aviv, and then says, we intended to destroy the vehicle, not the passengers, people would laugh. But how different is it if Israel drops a 1-ton bomb on a densely populated neighborhood in Gaza, as it did in July of 2002, and then said, oh, we didn't intend to kill civilians, we just intended to kill a Palestinian terrorist. When Israel drops a bomb on a hospital, it's like, oh yeah, there was a Hamas guy in there. The 300 people in there that were dying and we just killed them faster, they were worth it to get that one Hamas guy in there. And one old talking point that has been making the rounds again is, well, then they shouldn't have voted for Hamas. These guys deserve it because they voted for Hamas. Bullshit. But anyways, let's just talk about it again. The last election in Palestine was in 2006. 2006 was the last election, and the Palestinian age to vote is 18. Alright, so let's take a look at the age demographics of Palestine. 3.5% is over the age of 65. 4.7% is 55 to 64. 34.5 is 25 to 54. 21.8 is 15 to 24. And 36.1% is under the age of 14. So, right off the bat, 57.9% of the current population of Palestine did not even have a fucking choice in the matter. And I guarantee that number would be larger if we could divide that number in between, 25 to 35, because literally anybody who was below the age of 34 in Palestine did not have the ability to vote in that election because they, didn't exist, actually. They either didn't exist or they weren't old enough to vote. Also a thing to keep in mind, not everybody voted for Hamas in that election. So you're doing this to people who didn't even universally agree on this thing. And here's another factor. So what? So what? Palestinians voted for the wrong guy. And that doesn't make genocide okay. Since Americans don't have any object permanence outside of themselves, let's take a look at this picture. I guarantee you that a majority of you guys didn't vote for Donald Trump, right? I'm just going to take a general assumption and assume that a majority of the people in my audience didn't vote for Donald Trump. But even if you did, let's just take a look at this. Think about it like this. America in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. And then a message comes on the TV. It's a world leader from a country that doesn't like Donald Trump. They go, yeah, since you guys didn't vote for the candidate we wanted you to vote for, we're going to go ahead and drop some tactical nukes on you. Good day. Is that okay? Would you support that if that was the case? Unilateral punishment for voting for a candidate that you don't like? A candidate that I don't like either? And if you're on the left, this is the same kind of logic that the US government uses all the time. They overthrow a ton of Latin American leaders because they're like, nope, you voted for the wrong one. You're gonna have to pick a different one now. Actually, no you don't. We're gonna pick your leader. And they're gonna be a tool for us. The next thing that's been making the rounds is Pollywood. Now, Pollywood is the belief that Palestinians are faking deaths and injuries in order to gain sympathy from the West. And it all started because there was a camera that was pointed at a 12-year-old Palestinian boy after he got brutally murdered. If you genuinely believe that bullshit at all I have to say to you is, completely unrelated topic, completely unrelated to any of the situation whatsoever, Bo Burnham, his comedy special, Make Happy, that was a very interesting comedy special. My favorite song was the 13th one. Yeah, my favorite song was the 13th one on the special. Unironically, it's my favorite one, though, to be honest. But the last one is the biggest and most used example for defending Israel in this situation. Israel has the right to defend itself. Do Palestinians not? Also, I doubt those hospital and refugee camps were really that dangerous, to be honest. Now, one thing that a lot of people have been trying to figure out, well, not necessarily been trying to figure out, a lot of people kind of already know, but a question that some people might want to know if they're just getting into this topic is, why do people believe the way they do? Well, believe it or not, JJ McAuliffe actually did an okay video on the topic. I say okay because it falters a lot, because he does his typical soft left bashing by stating that anti-Semitism doesn't exist on the right wing nowadays, and it is basically a left-wing issue only, which is complete bullshit. But aside from that, it delves into a lot more as to why people feel the way they do about the conflict. But to broadly understand this, we have on the pro-Israel side, we have Christian fundamentalists who really, really, really want the rapture to happen. We have Islamophobes who really, really, really hate Muslims. The military-industrial complex who really, really, really wants a war. And then another crowd is, this is one crowd that the left kind of somehow struggles to understand is a thing. Jews, because, believe it or not, some people who are pro-State of Israel are Jewish. We've seen a lot of people try to remove that fact from supporting Israel, and yes, we do know there are people who are not Jewish who support the State of Israel, as I said before, Christian fundamentalists. And supporting the State of Israel isn't even necessarily that big of a factor within the Jewish community. But there are some Jews who do legitimately think that it is a good thing to have a Jewish state. For many factors, whether it be basically just like, yeah, you know, they're Jewish and ergo it can't be that bad, or, you know, rising anti-Semitism making them think, well, the fact that there is only one Jewish state in the world is, we need to make sure that is protected at all costs. Like, for example, there was this video that was spreading around very early on where it was like a college campus that was having a pro-Palestinian protest, and there was a Jewish student who was like crying her eyes out. She was a relatively young woman, and she was crying her eyes out and like saying like, she was like really like bawling her eyes out, legitimately saying that she believed that the Palestinian protesters were literally advocating for her genocide. Now, I clowned on her for saying that because it's like, that's not true, but also it's like, I can genuinely understand why she might think that. Granted, a lot of that is lies spread by the media, who are trying to trick people into thinking that being like being Jewish and being pro-Israel and being Zionist is one and the same, which is not only spread by people who are on the side of Israel, it is also being spread by people who are not on the side of Israel. And meanwhile, we have people on the Palestinian side who range from people who are anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-Western, and the biggest anti of all, but not the biggest in the movement, but the biggest anti in the sense that it is a bad one, anti-Semites. Like, yes, we have to acknowledge this factor. There are anti-Semites who are using the issue of Palestine to spread their anti-Semitic message. Do they care about Palestinian rights? Probably not, but they still spread their, like, bullshit under the guise of being pro-Palestinian. Like, I've been getting into a lot of arguments with this user on a website called R Campaigns, known as The Fixer. He's basically this Muslim conservative who pretends to be pro-Palestine, but then on the next day will call for Rashida Tlaib to be expelled from the United States Congress, and was basically doing the same thing that conservatives do about the, like, squad. Like, he's like, oh, we need to stop the jihad squad, doing the same old, like, oh, they have ties to Hamas or whatever. And then I pointed out the fact that it's like, I used that same logic against him, and then he tried to, like, do, like, I actually gave money to Palestinians, so you can't judge me for my support of Palestine. And it's like, I clapped back with the typical spiel that you would do, like, oh, you supported Hamas. And he's like, I doubt that the UN thing, like, it was a UN thing, and he's like, I doubt that they support, like, Hamas. And then I literally submitted an article that said, like, they've literally been accused of helping Hamas. So it's like, buddy, see, by you, I'm using your logic here against you. And then he said, I don't trust your website. And that was immediately suspect to me, because the site, like, I don't remember what the site was, but the site's name had the word Jewish in it. So it's like, wow, I wasn't even trying to make a point on that regard, but you literally just proved your point. You just hate Israel. You don't support Palestine. You literally just hate Israel. To which you responded, yes, he hates Israel. But he didn't say he supported Palestine. And another person that has kind of been showing this is Jackson Hinkle, who is now blowing up on Twitter, because Twitter is a far-right hellhole, and far-right people like him will naturally blow up. Who literally went around saying that Israel and Ukraine are Satanists. Making the claim that Israel is satanic. Very, very suspect. And to be clear, anti-Semitism will not be tolerated. If there's anti-Semitic comments under this video, you will get banned. I made a whole episode going over anti-Semitism on the left, and this will not be tolerated. Another thing that this is actually kind of shown in that regard is basically, this is kind of showing where people's loyalties are truly in this conflict. That's one thing we have to give some credit to this, because this is like the biggest test of whether or not you actually, where your actual loyalties lie. Because everywhere, everybody's being tested. First, we have the basic one. Who do you inevitably support? Israel or Palestine? But then we're going a little bit more than that. For example, now we're seeing about the pro-Palestinian side. We're seeing, are you supporting Palestine for the sake of supporting Palestine? Or are you doing it for malicious reasons? And we've been seeing a lot of those people officially come out of the woodwork, officially, like, basically being bullshit. Like, we've seen some people who were legitimately pro-Hamas, and now it's like, okay, now we know you're just pro-Hamas. Get out of here. And one thing that has been kind of disappointing was Second Thoughts, a YouTube channel that I thought was good, but then it's literally like today, I literally just saw that they were like retweeting a literal fascist who was spreading misinformation about the Israel-Palestine situation. And on the pro-Israel side, we're seeing people who are like, they're like, oh, we have somewhat of a sympathy towards Palestinians, and ones that legitimately just want Palestinians to be massacred. Now let's get into some broader political ramifications. And the thing about political ramifications is that we're seeing that political ramifications are changing. Like, Israel has not necessarily been as popular as they used to be. Support for Israel has changed a bit over the years. Like, naturally, it's just been generally shifting. And we've been seeing people on the right and on the left who've been gradually changing on this sort of issue. It's just generally been a sort of shift that we've been seeing with a lot of other issues, like NATO and stuff. Coinciding with movements on the right and the left getting a bit more radical, with the rise of the fact that the Washington Consensus is not really that good, especially with the Democratic Party, with the Democratic Party now being 49% in favor of Palestinians over Israelis. Another thing that's been very interesting is protests, because originally, at the very start, protests seemed to be a little bit, like, lax. But now, as this situation has been getting more big, protests have been starting, like, spreading up, not just around, like, not just in the nation, but around the world. Like, literally, there are a lot of countries that have had demonstrations against Israel. This is a slowly expanding list, but bear with me. Like, there have been protests in, of course, Israel and Palestine, obviously, against Israel. But we've also had Algeria, South Africa, Tunisia, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Pakistan, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cyprus, France, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, North Macedonia, Norway, Romania, Serbia, Spain, Switzerland, UK, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Oman, Yemen, Turkey, Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Uruguay, Venezuela, the United States, and Iran, Bahrain, and Russia. I include those three on the bottom, particularly because that last one in particular isn't necessarily a protest, because it was like there was a flight that was coming from Israel to a Russian airport, and then a bunch of Russians just started breaking into the airport and trying to round up the Israelis. Like, those guys suck. But anyways, otherwise, there have been protests around the world that I've been showing that people are getting sick and tired of Israel's bullshit. And as I mentioned in the stories of this episode, like many of those Latin American countries have just been basically cutting ties with Israel. And this has even started to delve into the Biden administration, because Biden has done a little things here and there. Like, he's tried his best to maintain some semblance of controlling Israel during the situation, trying to make sure that they don't go too far, while also being Israel's biggest simp, because he's the US president. And due to this, he's been losing some support among young voters, Arab voters, and Muslim voters. I don't know how this will affect him long term, but this is definitely troubling for Biden if he wants to maintain his victory. Though Trump and the GOP have basically been trying to make it clear, like, oh yeah, well, we're just going to be even more hardcore on the issue that'll make these guys then go, okay, maybe we'll just vote for Biden again. And Israel has been doing the thing that I think is weird, because I've been noticing this a lot. Notice how the fascists and, like, the empire as it is has been getting a lot more blatant and a lot more angry and a lot more visceral and taking a lot of actions that are very, very, very weird that even seem to go beyond what they would typically do. Well, I see it as like the fascists basically taking their last breath. Like in America, why do you think people are going super hard against trans people like right now? Because like they know they have to go this one extra mile. They have to do this. And why the fascist GOP is like trying to do all these like things to try and maintain power, because they know this is their last life. This is their last life of power. And Israel's been doing the same thing with this issue. They've been going really hard on the foreign propaganda to make this a big thing, because they know that if they don't do something big fast to make sure that Americans support them, then they won't be able to do what they want to do. They've been doing a ton of AI-generated images, particularly about dead Israeli children. Meanwhile, Palestinians, all they have is pesky real-life footage. They had a YouTube ad that was going around targeting kids. They've been going around spreading a lot of propaganda for the West. One of the biggest ones being Hamas equals ISIS, which, like, literally, if you know anything about the situation, you understand. No, they are not Hamas. Like, Hamas does not equal ISIS. These two are not even remotely similar. The only thing similar is that they're Sunni Islam and they're jihadist groups. Like, that's basically it. The two groups don't really like each other. And the only reason why, like, this wouldn't make sense to people who actually understand foreign policy. This only makes sense to dumb Americans who don't understand foreign policy. And still have ISIS. Like, I mean, when I saw this spreading around, I was legitimately thinking, like, what the fuck? Why are they saying this? ISIS hasn't been relevant in, like, years. But not to the average American. The average American still gets ISIS jokes every day, even when it makes no sense. Like, do you guys remember when ISIS was like a thing? Like, every single like adult like comedy would make a joke about ISIS, where it would be like Kanye West joins ISIS, or like it's like this really weird thing. It's like because like for some reason they want to make the joke about people being in ISIS and like make fun of ISIS, but the problem is, they always make the person who joins ISIS like someone who would literally never join ISIS. The one that came into my head right now was fucking Rick and Morty, where there was an episode where Beth, she fell on a farm, and there was like this rural farmhand who was speaking in this really southern rural accent, and he was like talking about like, why are you here? And she's like, where's your daughter? And he says, my daughter joined ISIS. It's like, yes, because I'm pretty sure a country bumpkin would join freaking ISIS. But the biggest Israeli lie was coming from the October 13th thing, and that ties into the next thing. Islamophobia is now really big, like at the point where it is literally post 9/11 bad. And the biggest one came from a incident that happened to Wadea Al-Fayoume, who was killed directly because of Israeli lies on this issue. Okay, so let me explain the situation. A former leader of Hamas told the Arab world that on October 13th, he wanted Muslims around the world to take to the streets to protest in favor of Gaza. And then Israel turned to the Western media and then said that what he was actually doing was calling for a national day of jihad. Now, if you don't know what jihad means, jihad is basically resistance. Now, resistance can mean a lot of different things. We, of course, interpret jihad and resistance to mean a violent way, and it's very typical to be violent, but sometimes it can be non-violent. But Americans don't see it that way, which led to the kid's 71-year-old landlord to think that the kid and his mom were planning something, so he killed them. This isn't the first time where a phrase can be interpreted in the wrong way, such as Allahu Akbar, which for some reason has been interpreted to basically be the typical phrase to say before a bombing, when it is literally just saying God is great. And the reason why jihadist fighters say that before they bomb themselves is because it's basically a final prayer. Also, as I said before, people are just generally really unsympathetic to the Palestinians. Like, not even to the point where it's literally just like, they're only doing this to say, like, we want to hurt Hamas. No, like, they basically just had the point where, like, there was, like, a video that was spreading around of, like, a pro-Israel protest where they were literally just saying, turn Gaza into a parking lot, unironically. Now, the last question that I should be wondering is, what can we do? Now, the short term is very simple. Have the U.S. government, like as a U.S. government, or government in general, initiate a ceasefire, and then have Israel pull back from Gaza, so as a start. But for a lot of us, I guarantee we're not really having that many people in the government officials, so what you can do is you can call your representative or senator to, like, try and get their attention on this issue, but the fact of the matter is, if they're not co-signing a ceasefire now, there's a good chance they probably won't. I think literally at this point the only person in the U.S. Congress that can be pushed on the issue is maybe Bernie, but even then it's like Bernie's kind of called for a ceasefire, but like without using the term ceasefire. But like I live in a state with 2 Republican senators, and my Democratic representative tweets stuff like America's bond with Israel is unbreakable. So it's like I got nothing. Like, I mean, if your congressman or representative isn't in the calls for a ceasefire already, there's a good chance they probably won't. Even if they're progressive. Fact of the matter is, unless they're in like the squad or like the tertiary like squad plus, it's like there probably ain't really a case. What you can also do is attend a protest if you can. I would be a little weary about if the Party of Socialism and Liberation is involved in the protest. I mean, we saw what happened with DSA when they were affiliated with a PSL-related protest, and Eugene Prieur saying some very cringy things. But it's like, I mean, it's basically just like a mitigated risk, I guess. I mean, as long as there aren't really like that prominent right-wingers in the protest, I think you should be fine. Also, mask up. Disease season is coming up, and also there's a good chance you might get doxxed, apparently, at these protests. I'll also mention BDS, Boycott, Divest, Sanction, even though I don't necessarily know how relevant it is to this particular moment. But I'm just mentioning it for the sake of it is a way that you can, I guess, try to stick it to Israel or like try to make this issue brought up to your attention. But there's a good chance that your state's it's illegal in your state, so, I mean, you can still do it if you want, but, you know, that'll be a bit of a issue. Now, this last one is for the very, very, very low bottom of the totem pole people in this regard. The people who spend their day or whatever debating on Twitter with Zionists or pro-Israel people. What can you do? Well, the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, I don't think you're going to be able to convince them otherwise. But if there was one way to convince them otherwise, I would say this. Don't pull any punches. And when I say don't pull any punches, I mean go to the Time of Gaza Twitter account and start sending them some of those videos. And while you're there, feel free to retweet some of them so that they remain in circulation. Or you can save some of the worst videos and use them for that purpose. Send them to the people saying you support this. It's a little hard for them to have the moral high ground when you're showing them a video of an IDF soldier beating the brains out of a 13-year-old girl. Now, what's the long-term solution? That's a bit complicated, because there's still a little bit of a divide in the Palestinian community, in the pro-Palestine community, to figure out what the solution should be. The most common answer that we've seen is a two-state solution. Very simple solution. You definitively draw borders. Israel stays here, Palestine stays here. Some go a bit more into say that the borders should be done in a specific way, like going back to the 1948 partition plan, but a lot of people would view that as not good enough and or too far gone. So many now support the idea of a one-state solution, and not like the Likud or Hamas interpretations, where the two states would effectively merge into one. Palestinians that were displaced would have the right of return, and there would be no more apartheid, kumbaya, blah blah blah. That's the small problem. I don't necessarily think it solves the issues, especially considering Israel already sees itself as a one-state solution. Literally, Israel describes the one-state solution as a one-state reality. Now, I'm not necessarily here to get bogged down in the details between those two plans, because realistically, my number one priority is stopping the genocide and expansion of the Palestinians, so we can fight about all that bullshit later. I guess I should mention one thing, because, I do support a two-state solution, but I think some people might grow weary about it in my comments and go but wait a second, I saw you tweet and or say the phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. Yes, but I interpret that to just be a slogan, really. Not only because there was a tweet where someone was trying to point out but that's technically anti-Semitic because it just means the destruction of Israel. Someone pointed out how the UN partition plan actually does have it so that Palestine exists from the river to the sea without Israel being destroyed. But also, again, I view it as it's like a slogan, not necessarily a actual plan, like the slogan defund the police. Some interpret that to be police abolition, while some interpret that to be a small slogan that represents a broader policy plan. But honestly, I didn't really want to make this episode because I really thought that I had more faith in humanity. Because, legitimately, after seeing any of this stuff, not listening to me talk about it on this podcast, but actually going through and researching any of this stuff on your own, as I did to prepare for this episode, I honestly cannot see how anybody could look at the situation that is going on in Israel and Palestine right now and then go, Israel is the good guys and that Palestine should not be supported. I literally cannot fathom a person who would literally look at the Palestinian genocide that has been going on since 1948 and then go, the Palestinians, they're the aggressors. They're the ones who are causing the problems. I legitimately cannot fathom that. And the fact that there are people who still believe this is just sickening. So yeah, that's pretty much all I gotta say on that. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.